Thank you very much, Professor Chupal. It is a great honor to be here and to participate in this conference, though it is a rather formidable honor to follow Mr. Akbar and his general overview of of Asia, the problems of its meaning, its history, and the current prospects. That's a hard act to follow, and I'm glad that we had a long tea break so that people can adjust to a more normal spectrum of ideas to be presented by myself and my fellow panelists. But before I start, I certainly need to thank IDSA and GIGA and the China Foreign Affairs University, and last but not least, my home institution, University of Virginia, for forming this multilateral discussion and for persisting in this. I think that multilateral discussions are extremely important. They're not cockpits of differences. They really provide the opportunity to explore similarities that might not occur if everyone that is talking is sitting on the same bench, is part of the same team. If other teams are there and they're not competing, then the commonalities of situation can be discussed. I think this is particularly important for our fundamental topic of today, of changing Asia. This topic, usually the attention of media and the publics and inevitably politicians as well, is attracted by crises and stereotype confrontations of states and leaders. And I'm not going to deny the importance of that. We're all interested in the North Korean missile program, for instance. However, the more fundamental duty for academics and for strategic policymakers and for the intelligence communities is to perceive deeper trends and their significance. And this century, which is only 17 years old, has shown the potential for many deeper trends, many innovations at the structural level that we have to adjust our thinking, or else we'll not only end up fighting the last war, but maybe unnecessary wars, or are missing through excessive caution opportunities for cooperation. Because I think this century is changing not only the relative power of states, it is also changing what power can do. And so we need to rethink from basics. And since my background is in philosophy, I welcome that kind of challenge. So what I'd like to do in my talk is suggest a couple of new vocabularies and then a reappraisal of the Indo-Pacific situation. And so I think Indo-Pacific, as I'll be arguing, is no less clear in its meaning than Asia for Mr. Akbar, but still it's worth that is the sort of geopolitical area of confluence of China and India, and therefore worth paying special attention to. And Professor Kerner pointed out that the constructivists are usually deconstructing. I'm happy to introduce two new terms to actually be a constructivist. I hope that these terms will be useful. And so the terms I would like to suggest are, in talking about the structure of international relationships, I think we should talk about this as multi-nodal rather than multipolar. And so here I go against the title of our session. But the reason for that is that I think that the emphasis on multi-nodal tends to be on a group of countries that is in charge, or whose conflicts among that group will determine what is of significance in world politics. I don't think that's the case. Certainly power matters, but it doesn't really determine. So what we have in this contemporary world of globalization, although I think a more general idea would be connectivity rather than simply globalization. What we have is a world in which everyone has an expansion, every individual and states, and as one of the presentations tomorrow will point out, even subnational units have greater choice. but they also have greater exposure to the choices made by others. So this connectivity world, this multinodal world, is a world of attention to others, but not necessarily control by a group of the rest. There's not a polar club that is the only one worth paying attention to. These asymmetric relationships between smaller and larger powers are not easily dominated by the larger powers. With connectivity, there's a decrease in the possibility of effective domination. Now, relative power remains important, but it doesn't simply determine outcomes. From a Chinese perspective, look at China's control over North Korea. Not terribly. That would I should perhaps, to put it in a more Chinese term, China's headache with North Korea. And for India, what about Pakistan? Certainly India is more powerful. Pakistan doesn't always do what India wants it to do. So we have this, in this relative power situation, what are the connecting points? I call them nodes. Now, I have to say that spelling autocorrect corrects multinodal to multimodal, and that really bothers me. So be careful about that. But it's multinodal because just like the nodes on the internet are crisscrossing nodes of communication or whatever, attention is concentrated. The significance of interaction is different between larger nodes and smaller nodes, but it doesn't mean that the largest node, the central node, controls the others. It's a much more complicated relationship. Okay, now one last problem with this new term of multinodal is when I presented this in Shanghai a couple of years ago, someone got up at the end and they said, "Oh, multinodal. I thought you were saying multi-noodle." And all of a sudden, a very nice metaphor of multinodal relationships, a bunch of noodles, struck me as possibility. But no, nodal, not noodle. Okay, so that's the first word. And the first way of thinking about things, where power counts but it doesn't determine in the contemporary world. So the question is how to manage power if you're on the strong side of a relationship, and how to manage vulnerability if you're on the weaker side of the relationship. Okay, the second word that I would like to emphasize, which spell check also doesn't like, is locatedness. And the reason I emphasize locatedness is that most IR theory originating in the U.S. in the Cold War stresses a sort of abstract notion of international relationships. But countries are in places, and they stay in those places, basically, unless they're nomadic. That hasn't happened for a while. Or they subdivide. So locatedness is important. And it's not simply a flat geographical or geopolitical notion of locatedness, because one's interests are located, and therefore one's perspective is located. And in dealing with other countries, the other countries always want you to see it my way, which means forget your way. Okay, just see it my way. But in fact, there are inevitably and persistingly two different ways of seeing it. They could have common interests, they could have cooperation or whatever, but locatedness, the fact that one's interest cannot simply be subsumed into someone else's interest, is a key problem. And when you look at asymmetric relationships, you look at relationships between large and small countries, the larger country simply has less interest, standing interest anyway, in the relationship because it is less at risk. And the smaller country, however, has more at risk, more exposure in the relationship proportionally, and therefore is more involved. I won't go into the details of what difference this makes. I have a couple of books on the subject. But trust me for right now that asymmetry in a relationship defines a kind of structural misperception, a possibility of a structural misperception that must be managed, or else the relationship will get out of control. And then locatedness also is specific. You have this neighbor and that neighbor and this neighbor and that neighbor are different. You have relationships that are persistent. You have histories of relationships, and these relationships are long-term. So instead of being able to the most appropriate way of thinking of a located relationship is not to win a transaction, but to build a relationship. The art of the deal might create a victory on some tactical matter, but strategically it proves the difference of interest between you and your partner. So, locatedness is my second term. Now, I would like to talk about regions, and India's region and China's non-region. If we look at South Asia and India's centrality to South Asia, the presentation by His Excellency Mr. Akbar was very good. You know, the Himalayas are hard to cross. I've been to Tibet 6 times, and just breathing is difficult in Tibet, much less crossing mountains and doing something on the other side. South Asia is isolated by the Himalayas. It's isolated by 2 oceans, and on the further borders of those oceans are not populations or economies of comparable mass. So you have in South Asia probably the most natural region of any place, and yet the World Bank calls it the least economically integrated region in the world. And I think the World Bank is correct, and that's one of the things I'll be talking about. But India is central to that region. Why is that region, why doesn't it operate like a region? That's a question that we have to deal with. Now, China is a very different situation. First of all, China itself can be called a region state because of diversity within China. Secondly, it's next to Southeast Asia, it's next to it's part of Northeast Asia, it has Central Asia, so it doesn't have, and those regions are sufficiently disconnected so that it's hard to speak of meaningfully of an East Asia that China is a member of. It's rather relates to these different, more coherent Asias. China's multi-region, and yet now, since 1980, China has been growing and has been re-centralizing its relationship with its neighbors. This is re-centralization because Zhongguo, the central country, China, always had the advantage of location, population, and productivity, and therefore it was in a central position in East Asia, or say among its neighbors. Then it lost the productivity. It actually became the periphery to a Western world in the modern era. But now it is regaining that leadership, and when Nadine Godehart presents on the Belt and Road Initiative, we'll certainly hear more about this recentering of Asia on China. So what difference does that make? What does that do to the Indo-Pacific? Is Indo-Pacific the new Afro-Asia? Is that a term? The reason I use the term is because at our last conference in Hamburg, there was a popular term. And I had problems with it because Indo-Pacific covers 75 degrees of longitude, 75% of the world's degrees of longitude and all of the latitude habitable. So it's too big to be a region. If Asia's a problem, Indo-Pacific is really a problem. But it's not unmeaningful. I think the term will become more used, but not because it's forming a coherent region, but because it's a theater of contact between China and India. So What does it mean to have China in India's neighborhood? Well, it diminishes India's natural monopoly of regional power. India is at a hub and spokes relationship. Our welcoming speaker last night, Mr. Cameron, I am an optimist, a structural optimist. That is, I think things can go wrong, but things that go wrong tend to be dead ends and therefore in long term corrected. But realism is an international relations should mean action within the parameters of feasibility. And so to understand the changing parameters of feasibility in Asia is key. And for the world, and especially for China and India, those parameters are changing. And it's more than a question of relative power, it's a question of what power means. The presence in each other's neighborhoods cannot be eliminated, but it can serve as a stimulant to better regional management, and this would be to the long-term benefit of all. Thank you.